In this series, I'm going to talk to you about dead people. You know, it's getting so today that by a mere twist of the dial, you can get your people practically any way you want them. Very much like off a restaurant menu. Live people who are very live. Live people who you think ought to be dead. Maybe they should. Half-dead people whom medical science is trying to bring back to full health and vitality. Now, nothing like that on this show. These are dead people, very dead. And yet it's a strange thing. Even though history has as its subject dead people, history itself is not dead. In fact, it's one of the most alive of studies. It can be very fascinating, can be very interesting, can be very enthralling. Now, if any of you out there are inclined to say, I'm from Missouri, my answer to you first is, so am I. And secondly, I'm going to take you up on the challenge. History can be interesting. I'm going to try and show you. Now, if you like people, and who of us does not, then you have to like history. Because after all, that's what history is. It's the story of man, the story of people. Man, what he did, what he dreamed, what happened when he was good, what happened when he was less good, what happened when he was successful, what happened when he failed. Study history, and you're really studying yourself, even though you may not think it. You're studying yourself, you're studying your neighbors, you're studying your associates. Now I ask you, what could be more interesting, more fascinating than such a study? Now, by way of a test case, I'm going to take the colonial centuries of North American history. Now, besides giving me an opportunity to prove to you that history can be interesting, there's another byproduct of this. Studying these centuries will give us some idea and some necessary background for a greater understanding and appreciation of our own national history. And something more. We cannot understand our USA if we limit ourselves to a narrow strip of colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. A baker's dozen, which England founded there, which ultimately revolted from the mother country and went off on their own. In order to understand, fully understand the USA, we have to go more broadly than that. And for that reason, I'm going to do this series on something of a continental basis. We're going to study more than the English. Now, we're going to start by seeing how there happened to be a U.S. history in the first place, an American history. In order to answer that question, we have to go very far back and very far away, back to the Middle Ages and over to the Old World. In history, as in every human life, our own, those of the people around us, there are a few big things and many, many little things that are woven into the pattern. And as the song goes, little things mean a lot. Now, relax, I'm not going to sing. That's not a cue for the orchestra. But it's amazing how often little things start great movements rolling. And here we have a case in point. I wonder if you ever realized how close you are to the beginnings of American history when you reach for the pepper shaker at table, or when you poke cloves into a succulent ham, when you enjoy the tang of cinnamon toast, or when you dust your Christmas eggnog with a bit of nutmeg. Really, you're very, very close. Let me show you why. See, we've emphasized spices. Let me show you why spices are so close to the beginning of that story. You know, as a matter of fact, if you were on a quiz show and the question was asked you, how there happens to be an American history in one word, 15 seconds, and please no help from your classmates. If you were to say spices, I'd give you the prize. I don't know whether anybody else would or not, but let me show you why. Now, we said we had to go clear back to the Middle Ages. America was discovered, really, because, for centuries before that epical day at the end of the 15th, Europeans had been looking eastward. The Crusades had oriented their attention to the east. Those military expeditions, you know, which went out to try to conquer the Holy Land, beginning at the end of the 11th and carrying through into the 13th century. Now, the Crusades had very important effects or influences upon Europe. It broadened the outlook of Europe. Up to this time, Europe had been pretty much closed in on itself for a variety of reasons which we'll not take time to explain here. But she had been closed in on herself. Now, this broadened their outlook. More than that, the Crusades brought Europeans into contact with a much more luxurious and luxuriant culture than Europe at that day knew. The culture of the Levant, of the Near East. And indirectly, the Crusades put Europe into contact with the culture of the farther East. They did this through the products. For example, when the Crusaders got over here to fight in the Holy Land, they picked up, or they came in contact with all kinds of products, some of them native to that area, some of them brought in from afar. Fine textiles, porcelains, perfumes, and most of all, spices. And they brought back samples of these when they came. Now, for a long time, many of these things, the fine textiles, the silks, and the satins, and the damasks, and so on, were beyond the reach of the common people. But spices, this was something which, well, Minnie and Jake could use, which Minnie and Jake often had, enough funds to buy, and they needed spices badly. Now, it's pretty hard to imagine how drab and how monotonous the European winter diet was. In those days, it was generally necessary toward the end of the fall to butcher what was the meat that was to be used during the winter. Now, there was no high-class system of refrigeration, no deep freezes and so on and so forth at that time. So to preserve this meat, there were only 2 or 3 ways. They could salt it, or they could smoke it, or they could dry it. Now, sit yourself down in imagination. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, salt meat. Vary it with fish on Friday, but then start in all over again. Pretty dull. Now, that's one of the reasons why, when the Crusaders brought back such things as cloves and cinnamon, particularly pepper, the Europeans grabbed at it. This could help vary their diet. It also helped in other ways. For example, the spices were used to kind of tone up the thin beer that they had. You know, the beer in those days, I think it was of that Just Right brand. Any worse, you couldn't drink it. Any better, you couldn't buy it. Just Right. Their wine, spices in the wine would help. Remember, among these things that came in, sugar was among them. Then, too, there were other products of the East, as we mentioned, perfume, silks, porcelains, and the like. At any rate, when the Crusaders got back, and when the Crusaders began to either tell of their experiences or brought the samples, and Jake gave this to Minnie, or Minnie fixed up the dinner, and then Jake shook a little bit of this on it, it changed it. There was a great demand for Oriental goods. Now, whenever you have a demand and when there is a supply, you're going to have somebody in between. to act as a middleman to bring the supply to the demand. And the Italians were in a great position to do this. Geographically, they were magnificently located right in the center, at the crossroads of the Mediterranean. The Italians, more than that, they had the ships, they had the capital, they had the commercial know-how, and they jumped at the opportunity. Now, no middleman is in business simply because he wants to do somebody else a favor. He's going to receive a certain amount of profit for the service which he renders. And over the years, with the tremendous demand in the north for these Oriental products, the Italian middlemen began to wax very, very strong, and economically strong, and very wealthy. Now, as time went on, the merchants in the north began to grow, and they began to see these Italian middlemen, see how wealthy they were becoming through this trade, and began to envy them. They began to dream of how they could get to the east, bypass, circumvent the Italian middlemen, but geography always stood in their way. Then, so to speak, to add insult to injury, travelers began to work their way out to these people like Marco Polo, and came back and wrote of their experiences. Reading the book of Marco Polo, telling about the magnificence, the wealth, and so on of China, a great number of Europeans began to dream great dreams, and their greeds were whetted, their greeds were sharpened. Now, all this was great, but geography, as I say, was blocking them. The Italians had the corner on the key spot. Now, if this wasn't bad enough, in the 14th and in the 15th century, we gradually get to the point where a new factor enters in, and these are the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Turks have, since the days of the Crusades, moved in from the east. They've displaced or conquered the Seljuk Turks. They've taken over, and little by little have extended their holdings up through the Levant into Asia Minor, and ultimately, midway through the 15th century in 1453, they conquer Constantinople. So the result is that they control the whole of the Near East. Now, this could be difficult. In case of war, for example, with the Turks, which was perfectly likely, the Turks could close off the trade routes, and things which had become necessities now in the European setup, Europe would be without them. Now, the Turks were too smart to do this. Instead, the Turks said, we're sitting on a good thing. Why not put heavy taxes on these goods that are passing to the Christian dogs? It couldn't happen to nicer people, and so they did. Now, what effect did that have? The prices skyrocketed, and many of the people in the north, many of the merchants in the north, and the people too, were in a very difficult position. Little by little, the conviction came, something has to be done about this. Now, very interestingly, the Portuguese were already doing something. Portugal, this little country over here on the Iberian Peninsula, it had relatively recently driven out the Muslim invaders. It was a country that was full of pep, power, and punch, and vim, vigor, and vitality, and so on, looking to expand. Now, expansion by land against the strong Castilian neighbor was more or less out of the question. So they began to think of expansion over here to North Africa. In 1415, the Portuguese set up an operation and got a toehold at in North Africa, the stronghold of Ceuta across the Straits of Gibraltar. Now, the Portuguese king turned this territory over to one of his younger sons, Prince Henry. History subsequently has dubbed him Prince Henry the Navigator. And Prince Henry began to dream a dream. He began to dream a dream of, well, he said, look, if we could pressure the Mohammedans in this area. Not only would we be doing Christianity a favor, but we would be gathering for ourselves, we'd be gathering an area which is economically valuable. But little Portugal, manpower shortage and so on, she could hardly think to undertake an aggressive crusade against Islam by herself. Now, in those days, there were a lot of rumors about the East and so on current in Europe, and one of these had to do with a fabulously wealthy, powerful Christian king, Prester John, known as Prester John of the Indies. They didn't know exactly where he came from, but they knew that, somewhere down here, somewhere down here. At that time, they had very little idea of the configuration of the African continent. So Henry decides, why don't we make contact with Prester John? Well, now, there was going to be one difficulty. He was faced with a geographical difficulty, too. He could hardly send his searchers, so to speak, across Africa. In other words, just push right through the Mohammedan people and say, pardon us, folks, we want to go over and make contact with Prester John so the two of us can get together and clobber you characters. It's not that. He was forced to the sea. Now, he establishes his headquarters down here at the tip of Portugal, and little by little begins to send out his men. They edge out into this mysterious ocean. Remember that the Europeans cloaked the Atlantic with a veil of mystery. Oh, the people who thought that the world was flat, you'd sail out so far, and then there you were, or there you weren't. And then the sea boiling and the winds burning and so on and so forth. They stuck pretty close to the shore. But the Portuguese, little by little, edge out. They discover or rediscover some of these island groups which the ancients had known, like the Azores or like the Madeiras, like the Canaries, ultimately the Cape Verdes. Now, during the process, they begin to change and to lose this idea of the crusade. And as circumstances work out, they desire to get around Africa so as to have an all-water route to the Indies, by which, or on which, through which, they can bypass the Italians and they can get around the Turks who might be troublesome. Now, in the process of this exploration, the Portuguese build up some very, very valuable maritime knowledge. For example, in recent times, a number of new navigational instruments have been introduced into the West. The compass has come in, and now the Portuguese experiment with it. The astrolabe has come in. Now, that peculiar instrument that our friend Prince Henry is using is an astrolabe. You know, we're little, we just didn't have time to go out and buy one, so we'll use that. Then, a great deal of information, or a great deal of experience in sailing the Atlantic, sailing the open ocean, quite different from sailing the Mediterranean. This has its influence in the development of new types of ships, the Portuguese caravel, the Spanish galleon, which are to be so important as time goes on. Now, little by little, the Portuguese inch their way down. They get here and then start eastward with great hope. And then with great disappointment, they find that this African continent, instead of cutting off and opening the way to the east, it goes on southward. And year after year, they figure it's interminably southward. But at any rate, Portugal is doing something. And Portugal is the center of a great deal of interest. Now, it was in the late summer of 1476 that a rather bedraggled, waterlogged individual managed to scramble upon the Portuguese beach near Lagos. This was the man of destiny, Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus was a Genoese. We're not going to argue about this business of his origin. Historians have done that considerably. We'll take the traditional explanation, which seems to be the right explanation. One of his recent biographers said, all this hue and cry about Columbus's origin, the people who knew him said he was a Genoese. Why should we, in the 19th or the 20th century, think that we know more than his contemporaries? He was born sometime around the middle of the 15th century. His father was a weaver and a cloth merchant, and rather understandably would have liked to have seen his son Chris follow in his footsteps. But Chris had other ideas. At a rather early age, he decided to follow the life of the sea. For a Genoese, that was not particularly surprising. He shipped on a couple of voyages over into the Aegean, to Chios, and then in this fateful year of 76, he was shipping on an expedition, a trading expedition, that was heading from Genoa on across the Mediterranean, through the Straits, and heading for Flanders, the Low Countries, up here, Belgium and Holland, of modern geographical terminology. Now, after they had gotten through the Strait of Gibraltar, they were overtaken by a French-Portuguese squadron. France and Genoa were reputing at the time, and the Genoese merchant ships were scattered. The ship upon which Columbus was sailing was sunk, but they were not particularly far from shore. Medieval mariners, as a general rule, held as closely to shore as they dared, so he was able to save himself by grabbing a piece of wreckage and propelling himself to the beach. Now, here he is, right in the heart and center of great interest in exploration. Now, it's a little bit doubtful whether he had his subsequent plans and his ideas at this time. Little by little, however, they do develop. Oh, within 2 or 3 years, following the talk that's around, doing some reading, and he conceives his idea. The Portuguese, year after year, are sending out expeditions, and each expedition comes back with disappointing information. Africa still is going southward. We haven't been able to get around it. So he begins to study. He said, okay, now, if the world is round, and remember, a great number of people in the Middle Ages thought the world was round. He didn't come up with a new idea. If the world is round, why can't one sail, for instance, here? If the world is round, why can't one just sail around it and ultimately get to the east? He studied some of the writers and the like, people like Marco Polo, and Marco Polo had some rather peculiar geographic ideas as to the extension into or eastward of Japan. So much so that Columbus felt that if he were to sail out maybe 3,000 or so miles to the west of the Iberian Peninsula, he would hit the east. And he had a certain amount of backing from scholars like Paolo Toscanelli and the like for this. So he conceives his idea. Now what he needs is finances and a royal sponsor. Now he very naturally starts out with King John of Portugal. And John listens to him, proposes his ideas to a commission of experts. You know, they had the equivalent of the PhDs, the boys in the ivory tower, in those days. And they kind of hold Columbus off, and John seems to have double-crossed him. He took all his information, all his ideas, and then sent a couple Portuguese out, but these boys did not come back with the desired information. Soon he saw that he was going to get nowhere, and then he went to Spain. And from Spain, or in Spain, he got the runaround a number of times, and then ultimately was given sponsorship by Ferdinand and Isabella. Now, this is a story much, much too well known for us to take time. You know how he picked up the ships. He had 3 ships. The largest of them was a very small one, the Santa Maria. They sailed out. They touched land. Columbus claimed the land for Spain, and then ultimately, after poking around in the Mediterranean for a time, the Caribbean for a time, went back home to announce that Spain had found the route to the Indies. Now, Columbus was in perfectly good faith. Spain thought that what he said was correct. So therefore, because he was looking for the East, he bumps into the Americas, and we have the basis for an American history. Now, what I'm going to do each time is suggest, in case you're interested in following up some of these ideas, suggest several books which you might care to read or to look at. Here is a book by Edward P. Cheney, The European Background of American History. It's in a rather common set. You ought to be able to find it very easily. Another book, a later treatment of the European background, but called The Dawn of a New Era, is by the same author. Now, there's been a great deal of work done on Columbus. However, one of the most recent and one of the finest lives of Columbus is this work of Samuel Eliot Morison, the Admiral of the Ocean Sea. Sometimes you'll find it in a compressed one volume, as here, sometimes in a more diffuse two-volume edition in which there are several more technical chapters. Then, I'd really be doing you a disfavor if I didn't suggest my favorite author, and you'll see immediately why it is my favorite author. This is History of the Americas, Volume 1, The Colonial Americas, and, well, a certain chap, well, read it and see who did the writing. Now, it's been fun being with you, and we're going to, I hope, have as much fun in each subsequent session. Today we told you why Columbus sailed, how he happened to sail, and what he found. In the next session, we're going to say whom he found and talk about the men who found America centuries before him. And that's all until next week.